Now, in 3 weeks' time, the national census will be conducted, gathering data about our makeup as a country and guiding governments about where to send resources over the next 5 years. At the 2016 census, 2.8% of the population identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, up 0.3% since the previous survey in 2011. That number is set to increase dramatically this year. That's been the prediction, and not for the reasons you might expect. Some Australians are now becoming what's known as box tickers, a movement where non-Indigenous Australians nominate as being Aboriginal on official government forms in a hope to boost statistical numbers. One such person told the Daily Mail the change in identity made her feel more connected with the land and Aboriginal people and better about herself. Oh my gosh. Joining me to discuss the change in statistics is one person who celebrates both her Aboriginal and Celtic origins, Alice Springs Deputy Mayor Jacinta Price. Jacinta, thank you so much for joining me. What do you make of this move of non-Aboriginals to change their identity, to fudge the numbers in important surveys like the census?
I've known about this box ticker movement for quite some time now. I've been well aware of it. I've been well aware of the skew of statistics toward higher population rates of supposedly Indigenous Australians, particularly in the more built-up areas. I mean, there's a few things going on here. We've also got across Australia, 50% of those who identify as Indigenous marry and have children with those who aren't Indigenous. In places like Melbourne and Sydney, it's up to 80%. It's down around about 8 or 9% in places like the Northern Territory. But in the bigger built-up cities also, those who identify as an Indigenous are, I guess, culturally, linguistically, not much different to the next Australian, whereas, in places in the Northern Territory, there are vast cultural, linguistic differences going on. Now, of course, the huge problem with, I guess, the overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians is the fact that often funding for marginalised Indigenous Australians gets put elsewhere, where it's not actually helping the people that need it the most on the ground. The most marginalised Indigenous Australians are those in very remote and regional areas where there's populations of over 50% Indigenous Australians. In these areas, often the crime rate in places like this is more than 50%. The state or territory average, and quite often the highest rate, or the crime that outstrips all other crimes, is domestic and family violence amongst those. So, there are a lot of Indigenous people who are in need, who are disadvantaged in this country, and these box tickers are not doing them any favours.
Well, that's what I was going to say, that this is having a real impact on the ground. It's not just a matter of silly people ticking boxes and feeling better about themselves. It's actually going to be hurting people who need those resources devoted to those remote communities. But let me just read you one of these box tickers, this woman's statements on why she did this. She said, "I adopted this change because I didn't want to feel sorry to be an Australian. I love this country so much and I feel deeply connected to the land I live on. I empathise with Indigenous Aboriginals and feel this is a way of also showing support to them. The greater their number, the more funding and acknowledgement they are likely to receive." My God, what do you say to that, Jacinta? My goodness.
Oh, look, it just shows a level of ignorance. It really does. It's not doing marginalised Indigenous people a favour whatsoever. This is all very sort of self-driven. There's a lot of people in this country who feel bad for being white. And this is another issue that needs to be addressed, is that no human being should have to feel bad because of the colour of their skin. We have to stop demonising white Australians, white people in general, and playing out as though, again, it's just the victimised person of colour and the white person evil, bad. This is not right whatsoever. And like I've said, in my Warlpiri culture, if you are born in this country, you carry the spiritual essence of the creator ancestors in the place that you are from, the place you were born. You are part of this country regardless of your background. And that is the thinking we need to begin to have, so that all Australians can actually feel like they actually belong to this country. So this identity politics isn't doing us any favours. Box tickers aren't doing us any favours. Everybody's going off in all these extreme directions, and we need to just pull it back to what it means to be human, to what it means to be Australian. And, you know, we might have to start considering how we develop policy and how we do how we deliver funding, in that, well, let's just focus on the marginalised, regardless of the colour of their skin or their cultural background. That's where we have to focus. That's where we have to put our funding and our efforts, because you just can't expect people who are so very ignorant to do the right thing, clearly.
No, and you talked about that white guilt and white people being demonised. Do you think it's the guilt behind this phenomenon, or do you think it's people who want to access some of the benefits that are supposed to be reserved for our Indigenous community? Is there, am I being too cynical, thinking there's some self-interest in there?
That's definitely a driver. I hear stories all the time of people who say, oh, you know, I just, you know, my sister ticked the box for her kids at school. I know in my own upbringing, my father had to have a word to the assistant principal at one of my primary schools, because the school itself had ticked a box to say that I was a language speaker, because you get more support or funding if in fact my first language was not English. My first language was English. My second language was Warlpiri, but not my first language. So it happens all over the place, and it's been happening for some time now, where there are incentives, where there are extra support mechanisms for funding. All of that's been going on, you know, and now we're calling out box tickers, and there are Indigenous Australians who've had it up to here with the box tickers, and now we're getting box tickers coming out and saying, hey, I'm a box ticker. And why not? We're living in a world now where you can identify as just about anything that you want. So why wouldn't people turn around and, you know, continue to identify as Indigenous?
Well, yeah, I mean, if a bloke with a full beard can say I'm a woman, then why can't, you know, you have people identifying as a different race? Just lastly, there's also been concerns expressed that we've got so much focus on closing the gap. That's a really important issue. And these box tickers are actually messing up the statistics, because a lot of them, like you said, live in the inner city, are affluent, and it looks like that gap is closing, when in reality, perhaps it's not.
Look, it's definitely a contributing factor, and like I said, there are also the differences exist. The gap exists between the cities and remote and regional Australia, and in fact, it doesn't matter necessarily whether you're Indigenous or not in those cases, because what I've certainly found in my paper, Worlds Apart, is that it is marginalised Indigenous Australians are those, again, in regional and remote areas, those who are living in cities and have access to services, have access to a better education outcomes, all those sorts of things, employment outcomes. They are actually doing quite well. There's not much difference between Indigenous Australians in those areas and other regular Australians of different backgrounds. The most marginalised remain in regional and remote areas of Australia. And so we need to get realistic about how we support our marginalised Australians and Indigenous Australians. And the funding and the support and the services need to be provided where those marginalised Australians exist. I think we need to move away from the whole identifying as Indigenous and shifting all the funds and the services simply based on people identifying as Indigenous. Clearly, it's not working. It's not been working with closing the gap. It's not been giving us the right figures. We've got to change things.
Absolutely. Jacinta Price, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thanks for having me, Rita. Always a pleasure.